My parents said no birthday party this year because money was tight. I understood completely and agreed without argument. But 15 minutes later, while grabbing my forgotten phone charger from the kitchen, I overheard my mother on the phone planning an elaborate surprise celebration for my younger brother next month. The budget constraints apparently only applied to me. Standing there in stunned silence, I realized this was just the latest betrayal in a pattern I had been blind to my entire life. Everything I thought I knew about my family was about to shatter. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this shocking family drama that completely changed my perspective on everything, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. If this story resonates with you, or if you have experienced similar family favoritism, smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything. Trust me, you will want to stick around for this one because what happens next will blow your mind. My name is Serafina, and I had always been the responsible daughter. At 24, I still lived at home to help with expenses while working full-time as a graphic designer. My parents, David and Margaret, constantly praised my maturity and selflessness, especially when comparing me to my 21-year-old brother Lucas, who they described as their free spirit who needed extra support and understanding. When my 25th birthday approached, I mentioned hoping for a small celebration. Nothing extravagant, just dinner with the family and maybe a cake. My mother sighed heavily and explained that money was extremely tight this month. My father nodded gravely, mentioning unexpected medical bills and car repairs. They seemed genuinely distressed about disappointing me, so I quickly reassured them that I understood completely. Family financial stability was more important than any party. I genuinely meant it. I had always been the accommodating one, the daughter who never made waves or demanded attention. When Lucas needed money for his art supplies or wanted expensive concert tickets, somehow the budget magically expanded. When I needed professional clothes for work, I was directed to thrift stores and discount outlets. This had been the pattern my entire life, but I had internalized their explanations about Lucas needing more support because he was sensitive and artistic. That afternoon, I left my phone charger in the kitchen and returned to retrieve it while my parents thought I was upstairs. That is when I overheard my mother's conversation that changed everything. She was speaking excitedly about Lucas's upcoming birthday celebration, discussing catering options, venue rental, and a guest list of over 50 people. The budget she mentioned was more than 3 times my annual salary. But that was just the beginning of my discovery. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to things I had previously ignored or rationalized away. I noticed how my parents' financial stress seemed to evaporate whenever Lucas wanted something. When he mentioned wanting a new laptop for his digital art, they immediately started researching the best models despite claiming they could not afford my birthday dinner just days earlier. I decided to investigate our family's actual financial situation. Having helped my father organize his office several times, I knew where he kept important documents. What I discovered in his financial records shocked me beyond belief. My parents were not struggling financially at all. In fact, they were quite comfortable with substantial savings accounts and investment portfolios I had never known existed. But the most devastating discovery was a separate savings account labeled Lucas Future Fund, containing over $80,000. This was money my parents had been systematically setting aside for years, supposedly from my contributions to household expenses. Every month, I gave them money for rent, groceries, and utilities, believing I was helping during tough times. Instead, they were using my money to build a nest egg exclusively for my brother. The bank statements revealed a horrifying pattern spanning years. Every contribution I made to the household was deposited into Lucas's account after my parents covered the actual expenses from their regular income. I had been unknowingly funding my brother's future while being told constantly that we needed to tighten our belts and make sacrifices. Even worse, I found evidence that they had been actively discouraging opportunities that might lead to my financial independence. 3 years ago, I had been offered a promotion that would have required relocating to another city. My parents had convinced me to decline, claiming they desperately needed my financial support and could not manage without me. The bank records showed they were already financially stable at that time and had no need for my contributions. I also discovered that they had been intercepting some of my mail, including scholarship notifications and job opportunity letters that might have led to my moving out. Several envelopes addressed to me were hidden in my father's desk drawer, some dating back years. These included acceptance letters for graduate programs with full funding that I had never received, and job offers from companies I had never heard back from because the correspondence never reached me. The emotional manipulation ran even deeper than financial fraud. I found a notebook in my mother's handwriting containing what appeared to be strategies for keeping me financially dependent and emotionally invested in staying home. The entries detailed plans for creating artificial financial crises whenever I seemed too independent and methods for making Lucas appear more needy and deserving of resources. One particularly chilling entry read, "Serafina is too responsible for her own good. If she realizes how capable she is, she will leave and we will lose our financial buffer. Must continue emphasizing Lucas's artistic temperament and our struggling circumstances." The notebook also contained detailed records of lies they had told me over the years, including false claims about family medical emergencies that required my financial assistance, fabricated urgent repairs that needed immediate funding, and exaggerated accounts of their financial stress during times when they were actually quite comfortable. I realized that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of systematic deception. Every major decision I had made, from declining career opportunities to remaining financially dependent, had been manipulated by parents who saw me not as their beloved daughter, but as a convenient source of funding for their real priority, ensuring Lucas never had to face any financial responsibility or consequences. The most painful realization was understanding how thoroughly they had conditioned me to accept this treatment. They had convinced me that my worth lay in my usefulness to the family, while simultaneously ensuring I never developed enough independence to recognize the exploitation. They had weaponized my love and loyalty against me, creating a situation where questioning their treatment felt like betraying family values they had instilled in me. As I sat in my room that evening, staring at the evidence of years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse, I felt something shift inside me. The responsible, accommodating daughter they had shaped was disappearing, replaced by someone who finally understood the true nature of my situation. They had underestimated me, assuming I would never investigate or question their narrative. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. I spent 3 sleepless nights planning my approach. Simply confronting my parents would accomplish nothing except putting them on the defensive and giving them time to create new lies. Instead, I decided to document everything systematically and build an undeniable case before making any moves. My first step was creating copies of all the financial evidence. I photographed every bank statement, every entry in my mother's manipulation notebook, and every intercepted piece of mail. I also began recording conversations with my parents using an app on my phone, hoping to capture them in their lies about our financial situation. The recordings proved even more damaging than I had anticipated. Within just 2 days, I had captured my father explicitly telling Lucas not to worry about money, 'cause we have plenty saved up, followed immediately by him telling me that we needed to be extra careful with expenses this month. I recorded my mother complaining to her sister about how expensive Lucas's birthday party would be, then watching her tell me we could not afford to replace my broken work laptop. But I needed more than just evidence of their lies. I needed to understand the full scope of their deception and ensure they could not simply dismiss this as a misunderstanding. I decided to create a situation where they would be forced to reveal their true priorities in front of witnesses. I arranged a family dinner and invited my Aunt Rebecca, my father's sister, whom I had always been close to. Rebecca was a successful attorney who had often expressed concern about what she perceived as my parents' financial struggles. She had even offered to help with expenses in the past, offers my parents had declined while claiming they were managing fine. During dinner, I steered the conversation toward family finances, expressing worry about being a burden during such difficult times. My parents immediately launched into their usual narrative about struggling to make ends meet and having to make difficult sacrifices. They painted a picture of near poverty that contradicted everything I had discovered in their financial records. Rebecca listened with growing concern, eventually offering to help cover some expenses or even contribute toward Lucas's education fund. My father quickly declined, claiming they would never accept charity and were managing just fine despite the challenges. It was a masterful performance of humble pride masking supposed financial hardship. That is when I struck. I calmly pulled out my folder of evidence and placed it on the dining table. "That is interesting," I said, "because according to these bank statements, you have over $200,000 in various savings accounts, including $80,000 you have accumulated using my rent money without my knowledge." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at the documents as if they had materialized from thin air. Rebecca reached for the papers, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she reviewed the evidence. "These show systematic financial manipulation spanning years." Rebecca said, her attorney instincts taking over as she examined the documentation. "Serafina, you have been unknowingly funding an account exclusively for Lucas while being told the family was struggling financially." My mother's face went pale. "Serafina, you do not understand. We were trying to help Lucas build a foundation for his future. We knew you were responsible enough to be fine on your own, but Lucas needs more support. So you lied to me for years, stole my money, and sabotaged my opportunities to ensure I would remain financially dependent and available to fund Lucas's dreams." I asked, my voice remaining steady despite the rage building inside me. My father tried a different approach. "We never stole anything. You gave us that money willingly to help with household expenses." "Under false pretenses," Rebecca interjected sharply. "You created artificial financial emergencies and fabricated hardships to obtain money through deception. In legal terms, this constitutes fraud." I then produced my mother's notebook, reading aloud several entries about their strategies for keeping me financially dependent and emotionally manipulated. The room became even quieter as the calculated nature of their deception became undeniable. Rebecca was furious. "You have been systematically exploiting your own daughter's love and sense of responsibility. This is not just financial fraud, it is emotional abuse." But I was not finished. I played several of the recorded conversations, letting my parents hear their own voices contradicting the lies they had just told during dinner. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Lucas, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. "I did not know about any of this. I thought we were actually struggling financially." My mother immediately turned to him with tears in her eyes. "We just wanted to make sure you had opportunities, sweetheart. We knew how talented you were and wanted to protect your future." "By stealing from your sister and lying to your entire family," Rebecca demanded. The conversation that followed was brutal. Years of manipulation and favoritism were laid bare with example after example of how my parents had prioritized Lucas while exploiting me. Rebecca took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions that highlighted the legal implications of their actions. My parents' explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. They claimed they had meant to tell me about the savings account eventually, but could not explain why they had continued lying about financial hardships just days earlier. They insisted they had always planned to share the money equally, but could not explain why only Lucas had an account in his name. The most devastating moment came when my father, clearly panicking, claimed that I was overreacting and that family members should support each other without keeping score. I calmly asked him why that philosophy had never applied to Lucas contributing to household expenses or making any financial sacrifices whatsoever. "Lucas is different," my mother said weakly. "He is more sensitive and needs more support." "More honest would be saying Lucas is your favorite and I am just a convenient source of funding," I replied. Rebecca gathered all the evidence and stood up. "Serafina, you need to understand that what your parents have done constitutes serious financial fraud. You have legal options here, including potentially recovering all the money they obtained through deception." My parents' faces went ashen. They had clearly never considered that their behavior might have legal consequences. They had been so confident in their emotional manipulation tactics that they had never imagined being held actually accountable for their actions. I stood up as well, feeling stronger and more clear-headed than I had in years. "I need time to decide how to proceed, but I will no longer be contributing financially to this household, and I will be moving out within the month." As I gathered my evidence and prepared to leave the room, my mother made one last desperate attempt. "Serafina, please. You are destroying our family over money. We love you just as much as Lucas." I turned back to face her. "If this was about love, you would not have needed to lie, steal, and manipulate for years to get what you wanted. You would have treated me with the same respect and consideration you have always shown Lucas." The truth was finally out, but this was just the beginning of my journey toward justice. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room that I had paid for with money from my emergency savings account money I had been secretly accumulating despite believing my family desperately needed my financial contributions. The irony was not lost on me. While my parents had been manipulating me into giving them money for fabricated emergencies, I had still managed to save some funds by cutting my own personal expenses to the bone. Rebecca called me early that morning. After reviewing all the evidence more thoroughly, she had reached some concerning conclusions about the scope of my parents' deception. As an attorney, she recognized patterns that suggested this fraud might extend beyond just my financial contributions. "Serafina, I stayed up most of the night going through those documents," she said. "The level of planning and documentation suggests they have been running this manipulation for years with calculated precision. I think we need to investigate whether there might be other victims or other forms of fraud involved." She was right. My parents had been too systematic, too careful with their record keeping for this to be a simple case of favoritism that got out of hand. This was a long-term strategy that required significant planning and coordination. Rebecca suggested we meet with her colleague, Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in financial crimes within families. Detective Santos had seen numerous cases where financial abuse started with one victim, but often expanded to include other family members, friends, or even elderly relatives. During our meeting, Detective Santos reviewed my evidence and immediately recognized several red flags. "The intercepted mail alone suggests they have been systematically controlling your access to opportunities for years," she explained. "This level of control often extends to other areas. Have you ever noticed anything suspicious about how they handle other family members' finances or important documents? That question triggered a memory I had previously dismissed as unimportant. My grandmother had lived with us for 6 months before moving to assisted living 2 years ago. During that time, my parents had handled all her financial affairs, claiming they were helping her manage her accounts and medication expenses. My grandmother had seemed confused about her finances during that period, often asking about money she thought she had saved. Detective Santos leaned forward with interest. Did your grandmother ever mention specific amounts or accounts that your parents claimed did not exist? I remembered my grandmother asking repeatedly about a certificate of deposit worth $20,000 that she insisted she had never cashed. My parents had gently explained that she was becoming confused about her finances due to her age and that the CD had been cashed years earlier to pay for her medical expenses. "We need to investigate your grandmother's financial records," Detective Santos said immediately. If your parents were willing to systematically defraud their own daughter for years, they might have done the same to an elderly relative who was even more vulnerable. Rebecca arranged for us to visit my grandmother at her assisted living facility. At 86, Grandma Rose was sharp mentally despite some physical frailty. When we explained what we had discovered about my parents' financial manipulation, her reaction was immediate and intense. "I knew something was wrong," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "They convinced me I was becoming confused about my money, but I remembered everything clearly. That certificate of deposit was my emergency fund, and I never authorized them to cash it." Grandma Rose had kept meticulous financial records her entire life. She produced a small notebook where she had been tracking discrepancies between what my parents told her about her finances and what she remembered. The notebook contained over 15 separate instances where money had mysteriously disappeared from her accounts while she lived with my parents. "They told me I was developing memory problems and that I should let them handle all my finances to avoid making mistakes," she explained. "But I never forgot about that money. I just started believing maybe I was wrong about everything." Detective Santos documented everything carefully. The pattern was clear. My parents had used the same manipulation tactics on my grandmother that they had used on me, except they had targeted an elderly woman who was already worried about cognitive decline and therefore more vulnerable to gaslighting about her own memory and judgment. But our investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth. Rebecca discovered that my parents had been systematically accessing accounts belonging to several elderly relatives over the years, always volunteering to help with financial management during health crises or transitions. Each time, money had disappeared under various explanations about medical expenses, urgent repairs, or administrative fees. We found evidence of similar fraud targeting my great-uncle Frank, who had trusted my parents to manage his finances while he recovered from surgery last year. They had transferred $12,000 from his account to their own later, claiming the money had been needed for emergency home repairs that Frank's insurance did not cover. Frank had accepted this explanation despite never seeing any evidence of repairs or insurance claims. Detective Santos brought in a financial crimes specialist to help trace the full extent of the fraud. What we discovered was staggering. Over the past 8 years, my parents had systematically stolen nearly $150,000 from various family members through elaborate deception schemes. They had developed sophisticated strategies for targeting different types of victims. With me, they used guilt and family loyalty, creating false financial emergencies that appealed to my sense of responsibility. With elderly relatives, they exploited concerns about cognitive decline and positioned themselves as helpful caregivers who could manage complex financial matters. The financial specialist also uncovered evidence that my parents had been claiming some of these stolen funds as tax deductions, reporting them as charitable contributions or medical expenses for family members. This added federal tax fraud to their growing list of crimes. As word of our investigation spread through the extended family, more victims came forward. My cousin Jessica revealed that my parents had convinced her to invest $10,000 in what they claimed was a family business opportunity. The business never materialized, and my parents eventually claimed it had failed due to market conditions beyond their control. Jessica had accepted the loss, never realizing she had been deliberately defrauded. We also discovered that my parents had been using their reputation as struggling but responsible family members to obtain money from family friends and neighbors. They had collected thousands of dollars in loans and donations by claiming various emergencies and hardships, all while maintaining their comfortable lifestyle and substantial savings accounts. Detective Santos assembled what she described as one of the most comprehensive family fraud cases she had ever seen. The evidence included bank records showing systematic theft, recorded conversations, revealing deliberate deception, written documentation of manipulation strategies, and testimonies from multiple victims spanning nearly a decade. However, our investigation attracted unwanted attention from my parents, who began reaching out to other family members to control the narrative. They painted me as an ungrateful daughter who was trying to destroy the family over a simple misunderstanding about money. They claimed I was exaggerating minor financial disagreements and manipulating elderly relatives who were confused about their finances. Some family members began to express doubt about our investigation, particularly those who had not been directly victimized. My parents were skilled manipulators who had spent years building their reputation as devoted family caregivers who sacrificed their own comfort to help others. Their ability to appear sympathetic and misunderstood was remarkable. This division within the family created new challenges. Several relatives who had initially supported our investigation began questioning whether we were being too harsh or legally aggressive over what they saw as family financial disputes that should be resolved privately. My parents also began making strategic moves to protect themselves. They started returning some money to victims, claiming they had always intended to repay everything and were hurt that family members had misunderstood their intentions. They positioned these repayments as evidence of their good faith and proof that no actual fraud had occurred. But Detective Santos warned us that this strategy was common among financial criminals who realized they were facing serious legal consequences. They are trying to minimize their legal exposure and create reasonable doubt about their intentions, she explained. The fact that they are returning money now does not change the fact that they obtained it through systematic deception over many years. As the evidence mounted and the true scope of their crimes became clear, I realized that this case would require more than just family confrontation or private resolution. We were dealing with sophisticated criminals who had spent years perfecting their manipulation techniques and would continue targeting vulnerable family members unless they faced real consequences. The battle for justice was just beginning, and I was determined to ensure that every victim received restitution and that my parents faced appropriate accountability for their crimes. Just as our case was gaining momentum and Detective Santos was preparing to file formal charges, I received a devastating phone call from Rebecca. Her voice was shaky, completely different from the confident attorney who had been leading our investigation. "Serafina, we need to talk immediately. Something has happened that changes everything." We met at a coffee shop near her office, and I could see the stress etched on her face before she even spoke. She had always been my strongest ally, the family member who understood the legal implications and had the professional credibility to make our case stick. "Your parents contacted me yesterday," she began, avoiding eye contact. "They have information about my own financial situation that could destroy my career and my family." My stomach dropped. "What kind of information?" Rebecca took a shaky breath before explaining that 15 years ago during her divorce proceedings, she had hidden assets from her ex-husband to protect her daughter's college fund. The statute of limitations had passed, but if the information became public, it could result in disbarment and criminal charges related to perjury during the divorce proceedings. How could they possibly know about that? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand the scope of my parents' manipulation tactics. I made the mistake of confiding in your mother during that difficult time, Rebecca admitted. She was so supportive, so understanding. She even offered to help me hide some documents temporarily. I thought she was being a caring sister-in-law, but she was apparently documenting everything for future leverage. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only were my parents willing to blackmail their own family members, but they had been collecting compromising information for years, waiting for the right moment to use it as protection against exposure. They have offered me a deal, Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper. If I withdraw from your case and convince you to drop the investigation, they will destroy the evidence they have against me. If I continue helping you, they will anonymously report my past actions to the State Bar Association and provide evidence to my ex-husband's attorney. I stared at her in disbelief. So they have been collecting blackmail material on family members for over a decade. Rebecca nodded miserably. They also mentioned having compromising information about several other family members who have been supporting your investigation. They implied that anyone who continues helping you will face similar consequences. This revelation explained why some family members had suddenly become reluctant to cooperate with Detective Santos. My parents had apparently been making strategic contact with anyone who might threaten their position using whatever leverage they had accumulated over the years. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the defeat in her voice. "I cannot risk my career and my family's financial security, Serafina. I am sorry, but I have to withdraw from the case. They have me completely cornered." The next few days brought a cascade of similar betrayals. One by one, family members who had been supporting our investigation began backing away. My cousin Jessica suddenly claimed she had misremembered the details about her investment with my parents. My great-uncle Frank started insisting that the money he had given them was actually a gift, not a loan, taken through deception. Even Grandma Rose, who had been our most compelling witness, began expressing doubts about her own memories. During a visit, she seemed confused and withdrawn, mentioning that my parents had visited her several times to help clarify what had actually happened with her finances. "Maybe I was confused after all, dear," she said sadly. "Your parents showed me some documents that proved the certificate of deposit had been properly handled. I think my memory is not as reliable as I thought." Detective Santos was frustrated but not surprised. "This is why family financial fraud cases are so difficult to prosecute," she explained. "The perpetrators often have years of accumulated leverage over their victims, and they are not hesitant to use it when they feel threatened. Without family cooperation, our case was falling apart. The financial evidence was still damning, but without victim testimonies and with key witnesses recanting their statements, prosecution would be nearly impossible. My parents had effectively neutralized our investigation through systematic intimidation and blackmail. But the most devastating betrayal was yet to come. Lucas called me and asked to meet privately. Throughout this entire ordeal, he had remained mostly silent, claiming he was shocked by our parents' behavior and needed time to process everything. I had hoped that he might become an ally, especially since he had seemed genuinely surprised by the extent of their manipulation. "I have been thinking about everything that has happened," he said when we met. "I think you are taking this too far, Serafina. Yes, Mom and Dad made some mistakes with how they handled money, but they are still our parents. They love us and were trying to do what they thought was best." I stared at him in disbelief. "Lucas, they stole nearly $150,000 from family members. They have been systematically lying and manipulating people for years. This is not about parenting mistakes. But think about what you are doing to our family, he continued. You are destroying relationships that have taken decades to build. Is money really worth tearing apart our entire family? As he continued talking, I realized that my parents had gotten to him too. They had convinced him that I was the problem, that I was an ungrateful daughter who was using minor financial disagreements to destroy the family out of jealousy and spite. They have also been supporting me financially for years, Lucas admitted. If they go to prison or face major legal consequences, I will lose my financial support and have to drop out of art school. You would be destroying my future over something that happened in the past. The final piece of his betrayal became clear when he revealed that my parents had made him a formal offer. If he testified that he had always known about the family's financial arrangements and that I had willingly contributed to his education fund, they would transfer his savings account to him immediately and continue supporting his education. They are giving me a choice between supporting my sister's revenge campaign or securing my own future, he said. I am sorry, Serafina, but I cannot sacrifice my dreams for your need for justice. Sitting alone in my hotel room that evening, I realized that my parents had systematically dismantled every alliance I had built. They had neutralized family members through blackmail, intimidated elderly relatives through manipulation, and turned my own brother against me by appealing to his self-interest. Detective Santos called to inform me that without family cooperation, she would be closing the investigation. While she personally believed my parents were guilty of extensive fraud, she could not build a prosecutable case when all the victims had recanted their statements and key witnesses were refusing to cooperate. I had lost everything. My family relationships were destroyed, my support network had abandoned me, and the people who had systematically abused and defrauded me were going to face no consequences whatsoever. They had won through superior manipulation skills and years of strategic planning that I had never even suspected. But as I sat there contemplating my defeat, I realized that my parents had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that I would give up when faced with overwhelming opposition, just as I had done my entire life when confronted with conflict or difficulty. They had forgotten that their own manipulation had changed me. I was no longer the accommodating daughter who avoided confrontation and accepted unfair treatment. I had become someone who recognized injustice and refused to accept it regardless of the personal cost. 3 weeks after my investigation had seemingly collapsed, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Amanda Torres, a forensic accountant who specialized in complex family fraud cases. I have been following your case through Detective Santos, she explained. While the detective cannot continue her official investigation, I believe there might be federal implications that could allow us to pursue this through different channels. Amanda had spent 15 years investigating financial crimes and had developed innovative techniques for uncovering hidden assets and proving systematic fraud, even when local witnesses were unwilling to cooperate. She had read through all the evidence Detective Santos had compiled and identified several federal crimes that could be prosecuted regardless of family member cooperation. Your parents made a crucial mistake when they claimed some of their stolen funds as tax deductions, Amanda explained during our first meeting. Tax fraud is a federal crime, and the Internal Revenue Service has very different investigative capabilities than local law enforcement. She had already contacted the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, which had expressed significant interest in our case. Unlike local prosecutors who relied heavily on victim cooperation, federal tax investigators could build cases primarily through financial documentation and evidence of deliberate misrepresentation on tax returns. Amanda had also discovered something that none of us had previously considered. My parents had been claiming Lucas as a dependent on their tax returns, while simultaneously maintaining that all the money in his account came from legitimate family contributions rather than their income. This created a legal contradiction that suggested deliberate fraud rather than simple favoritism. If they were legitimately giving Lucas money from their own income, they could not also claim him as financially dependent, Amanda explained. The fact that they were doing both suggests they were deliberately misrepresenting their financial situation to avoid taxes while also hiding the source of his funding. But Amanda brought more than just new legal strategies. She had connections with a network of forensic investigators who specialized in cases where traditional witnesses had been intimidated or manipulated. She introduced me to Dr. Patricia Chin, a psychologist who specialized in documenting the effects of long-term family manipulation and financial abuse. Dr. Chin was particularly interested in my case because it demonstrated several psychological patterns that were commonly seen in systematic family fraud. She explained that my parents' behavior showed characteristics of narcissistic abuse, combined with sophisticated financial manipulation that went far beyond simple favoritism. What your parents did to you and other family members constitutes a form of psychological warfare, Dr. Chin explained. They systematically undermined your sense of reality and self-worth while creating financial dependence that made it difficult for you to escape their control. Dr. Chin had worked with numerous families where financial abuse had been used as a tool for maintaining psychological control over adult children. She was willing to provide expert testimony about the psychological impact of my parents' behavior and explain how their manipulation tactics constituted a pattern of deliberate abuse rather than misguided parenting. Through Amanda's network, I also connected with Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist who specialized in family financial crimes. Sarah had been working on a series about financial abuse within families and was particularly interested in cases where elderly relatives had been targeted alongside adult children. Your parents represent a sophisticated type of family predator that most people do not recognize, Sarah explained. They use their position as trusted family members to systematically exploit multiple victims over extended periods. Sarah's investigation had uncovered similar patterns in other families, and she was building a comprehensive article about how family financial predators operated. She was particularly interested in documenting how these criminals used psychological manipulation and blackmail to silence victims and avoid consequences. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered something that gave our case new momentum. My parents were not unique. She had identified several other families where similar patterns of systematic financial abuse had occurred, often involving the same basic strategies of creating false financial emergencies, intercepting mail, and using blackmail to silence victims. Through her investigative network, Sarah had found 3 other families where virtually identical fraud patterns had been documented. In each case, parents had systematically stolen from one adult child while favoring another, used elderly relatives as additional funding sources, and employed blackmail and intimidation when their behavior was discovered. This suggests your parents might be part of a larger pattern or might have learned these techniques from others who use similar methods, Sarah explained. If we can establish that they were using proven techniques for family financial abuse, it strengthens the case that their behavior was deliberately criminal rather than misguided parenting. Amanda used this information to build a comprehensive federal case that did not depend on family member cooperation. She documented the tax fraud, the systematic pattern of financial deception, and the use of blackmail to obstruct justice when their crimes were discovered. The federal investigators were particularly interested in the blackmail aspect of my parents' behavior. Using threats and intimidation to prevent victims from reporting financial crimes was itself a federal offense, and the evidence we had compiled clearly showed that my parents had systematically threatened family members to prevent them from cooperating with law enforcement. Amanda also discovered that my parents had made a critical error in their efforts to silence family members. Several of their threatening phone calls had crossed state lines when they contacted relatives who lived in other states. This made their intimidation tactics a federal crime rather than just a local matter. Chin helped me understand why my family members had been so easily manipulated into silence. Your parents had spent years conditioning everyone to prioritize family harmony over individual justice, she explained. They created a family culture where questioning their authority or demanding accountability was seen as betrayal rather than reasonable self-protection. She also helped me recognize that my own psychological recovery was just as important as achieving legal justice. Years of systematic manipulation had left me with significant trauma that needed professional attention, regardless of whether my parents faced legal consequences. Through therapy with Dr. Chen, I began to understand how my parents had systematically programmed me to accept mistreatment and prioritize their needs over my own well-being. This understanding gave me strength to continue fighting for justice, even when traditional support systems had failed. The combination of federal investigation expert psychological testimony, investigative journalism, and forensic accounting created a new foundation for our case that was far stronger than our original approach. We were no longer dependent on family cooperation or victim testimonies that could be manipulated through intimidation. Amanda assured me that federal prosecutors were very interested in making our case a precedent for how family financial fraud should be investigated and prosecuted. They wanted to send a message that using family relationships to commit systematic financial crimes would result in serious federal consequences. For the first time since my family had abandoned our investigation, I began to feel hope that real justice might be possible. My parents had won the first battle through superior manipulation and intimidation tactics, but they were about to face opponents who could not be easily intimidated or blackmailed. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse watching my parents being led away in handcuffs. The federal investigation that Amanda had initiated had uncovered even more extensive fraud than we had originally documented. The final charges included tax fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The federal prosecutors had built an ironclad case without requiring any testimony from intimidated family members. Amanda's forensic accounting had traced over $200,000 in stolen funds across multiple victims and several states. The tax fraud alone carried potential sentences of up to 5 years in federal prison for each parent. My father received 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to all victims plus substantial fines and penalties. My mother received 3.5 years and similar financial penalties. Both were also prohibited from managing finances for any elderly relatives and were required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. Lucas had ultimately testified for the prosecution after federal investigators discovered that he had been aware of the fraud for over 2 years and had been actively helping to conceal evidence. His cooperation earned him immunity from prosecution, but the revelation that he had been complicit in the fraud while pretending to be innocent had destroyed any remaining relationship between us. The federal case had also triggered investigations in 2 other states, where my parents had committed similar crimes against relatives. Additional charges were pending, which meant they would likely serve significantly longer sentences than their initial federal convictions. But the legal victory was only part of my recovery journey. Chin had helped me understand that healing from years of systematic psychological and financial abuse would require rebuilding my entire sense of self and relationships. "You have to learn to trust your own judgment again," she explained during one of our sessions. "Your parents systematically trained you to doubt your own perceptions and prioritize their needs over your own well-being." Recovery means rediscovering who you are when you are not being manipulated or exploited. The therapy process was difficult but transformative. I had to unlearn decades of conditioning that had taught me to accept mistreatment as normal family dynamics. I had to develop new skills for recognizing healthy relationships and setting appropriate boundaries with people who might try to exploit my naturally giving nature. 6 months after the trial, I moved to Portland, Oregon, where I accepted a position as senior graphic designer with a company that specialized in nonprofit marketing. For the first time in my adult life, I was able to keep my entire salary for my own use. The financial freedom was overwhelming at first, after years of believing that keeping money for myself was selfish and irresponsible. I also discovered that my natural generosity and caring nature were actually strengths when directed toward appropriate recipients. I began volunteering with organizations that helped other victims of family financial abuse, using my experience to help people recognize manipulation tactics and develop strategies for protecting themselves. Through my volunteer work, I met Maria, a social worker who had also survived financial abuse from family members, and Janet, a retired teacher whose adult children had systematically stolen her retirement savings. These women became my chosen family, providing the support and understanding that my biological family had never offered. The beautiful thing about chosen family, Maria explained during one of our weekly dinners, is that these relationships are based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and manipulation. Janet had become like a grandmother to me, providing the unconditional love and support that my biological grandmother had been prevented from giving due to my parents' interference. Through Janet, I learned what healthy family relationships actually looked like. My relationship with Grandma Rose had been partially restored after my parents' conviction. She had been moved to a new assisted living facility and was receiving therapy to help her process the financial and emotional abuse she had suffered. While her trust had been damaged, she had begun to remember our relationship before my parents' manipulation had distorted it. "I always knew you were special, dear," she told me during one visit. "I just got confused about everything else for a while." Detective Santos had stayed in touch throughout the federal investigation, and she told me that my case had become a model for how family financial fraud should be investigated. Several other law enforcement agencies had requested training based on the techniques Amanda had developed for our case. "Your willingness to fight for justice, even when everyone abandoned you, has helped dozens of other victims," Detective Santos explained. "The precedent set by your case is making it easier to prosecute family financial predators who previously escaped consequences through intimidation and manipulation." Amanda had also used our case as the foundation for a specialized practice focused on family financial crimes. She was now working with victims across the country who had faced similar systematic abuse from family members. Sarah's investigative article had been published in a major magazine and had generated significant public discussion about family financial abuse. The article had prompted several other victims to come forward with similar stories, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the personal growth I had experienced throughout this journey. I had transformed from someone who accepted mistreatment as normal into someone who recognized injustice and had the courage to fight against it. "You discovered that your worth is not dependent on how useful you are to other people," Dr. Chin observed during one of our final therapy sessions. "That is one of the most difficult lessons for abuse survivors to learn." I had also learned to trust my own judgment and instincts, skills that had been systematically undermined by years of manipulation. When new people entered my life, I could evaluate their character and intentions without constantly doubting my own perceptions. 2 years after my parents' conviction, I was living a life I had never imagined possible. I had genuine friendships based on mutual respect. A career that utilized my talents and provided financial security and a sense of self-worth that was not dependent on other people's approval or exploitation. The money my parents had stolen had been fully recovered and distributed to victims with interest and penalties. I had used my portion to establish a small foundation that provided financial assistance and legal support to other victims of family financial abuse. Justice is not just about punishment, I had learned. It is about creating a future where the same harm cannot happen again. Looking back on this journey, I realized that my parents had ultimately given me an unexpected gift. Their betrayal had forced me to discover my own strength and develop the skills necessary to build authentic relationships and protect myself from future manipulation. Have you ever discovered that family members you trusted were systematically betraying you behind your back? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself when everyone around you was telling you to just accept the mistreatment? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below about overcoming family manipulation and finding your own path to justice. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with your own experiences with family drama and betrayal. Subscribe for more real stories about standing up to toxic family dynamics and finding the strength to choose yourself over family loyalty. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar family financial abuse, because sometimes people need to know they are not alone and that fighting for justice is worth it. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that sometimes the family we choose is more important than the family we were born into. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than respect and honesty.